John, at the end of our last interview, you suggested that James Callaghan had got it wrong when he proposed a national curriculum to solve all the problems of English education. Why did you say that he was wrong?
Well, you must remember I have a lot of time for the way in which Jim Callaghan tried to get things organised. But again, he hadn't quite got the full background to all this. And the story is complex, but it has to be understood. 1902, the abolition of the school boards, elementary education stopped at the age of 14. Britain by 1938 had the lowest proportion of children still in school at the age of 14. It was a pretty average disaster. Callaghan came in with the great dream of rebuilding British society, and he went at it, hammer and tongs. And it was at that time that Churchill suggested to Butler that he bring about the new Education Act. Now, just before that, there was a very interesting publication by a man called Sir Richard Livingston, The Future of Education. Richard Livingston was just about to become Vice-Chancellor of Oxford, a famous classicist, a very educated person. And he wrote a book in 1941 called The Future of Education. And I quote from it because this is highly pertinent to what Callaghan didn't talk about. Livingston wrote, "Why are we an uneducated nation? And how can we become a better one? The chief uses of our present elementary education, it seems to me, are to enable a minority to proceed to further education and the rest to read the cheap press." This is the week of the Leveson inquiry. Now, in this book, he went on to say a number of things, but one was critically important. If a school sends out children with the desire for knowledge and some idea of how to acquire and use it, it will have done its work. Here's the real clincher. Too many children leave school with the appetite killed and the mind loaded with undigested lumps of information. The good schoolmaster is known by the number of valuable subjects that he declines to teach. Now, that was the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford in 1941. He then followed that up with a very interesting proposal. He said, "I don't quite understand what goes on in a child's brain, but it seems to me that up until the age of about 13 and a half, they're almost predisposed to sit and listen to a wise person in a classroom. But something is happening at the age of 13 or thereabouts that means that the child is desperate to get an insight into what happens in the real world. And not until they know about what the real world is about, then they want to discover what more learning is about." And so Livingston's solution in 1941 was to say that formal schooling should end at 13. And that for the next 3 years, every child should go into a form of apprenticeship for 3 days a week and have what he called continuation schooling for 2 days a week. And then, not until they were 16 or 17, would they be mature enough to follow a more elaborate curriculum. It was an eminently sensible idea, but it was too complex for Churchill to take on. And so Churchill went ahead and introduced the tripartite education system. And that was what Callaghan was reacting against. He looked at what had happened from 1944 to 65. He looked at the old secondary modern schools, and he must have groaned inwardly, because actually there were so many good school teachers in those secondary modern schools in the 1940s, 50s, and they thought our real aim is to liberate these children from the life of their parents, which was going to take them into yet another factory, another factory, another factory. And so the secondary modern teachers were actually quite gentle. They were more concerned to liberate the spirit of children than to develop their intellectual capacity. The grammar schools went the other way. And so by 1965, there was a horrible compromise that was coming out. And the compromise was, how on earth do we get everybody to be both socially well-adjusted and intellectually sharp? And here there is an issue which goes right through the story of English education and other education. It's really very simple. It's not so much what you know that matters as how you know how to know. Now, sitting here, I can honestly say that 40, 50 years after leaving school, I can't necessarily remember much of what I learnt at school. But what I do remember is how to carry on learning and doing things myself. And so the crunch problem in the 1960s was, how do you give people the ability to learn how to learn without flooding them with information? And this is where Callaghan fell into a trap. Because he said, well, in that case, let's have lots of tests for what children know. Now, it's very easy, or relatively easy, to get children to learn how to pass a test. That's a skill in its own right. But those skills are not necessarily transferable into everyday life. And when Callaghan said in 1976, I think we need a national curriculum, he fell down on the side of thinking that education could be measured in terms of content, not in terms of process. And this conflict between process and content has gone on ever since. And so really, Callaghan, who really was for the very best of motives looking at English society and saying it's falling apart, picked on the wrong sort of solution, because it was then taken up by Shirley Williams, it was then taken up by Keith Joseph, and then we come to the whole Kenneth Baker scenario, which will have to be the next 5-minute instalment.